So in A Constitution of Liberty, Hayek, and he sort of talks about how we enshrine political rules and procedures to protect individual rights while still enabling collective action to provide useful common goods. Political architecture encompassing divided government and checks and balances, what might be called procedural liberalism, is frequently the cornerstone of such constitutions, but history suggests that maintaining a constitution of liberty is quite difficult. So de facto change, separate from de jure change, which we will call constitutional drift, is the norm rather than the exception. So what we are attempting to explain here is how we go from a constitution of liberty, as described by Hayek and perhaps even Buchanan, to a constitution of social control, much like the picture depicts here. So the framework here builds off Nobel laureate James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock's pioneering contribution to political economy. Here they set up a two-stage process or political game. There's two separate stages, the first being the rules of the game, where we establish the formal rules about, not only rules about the game, but rules about how those rules themselves will be changed, so meta rules, so to speak. And then, of course, play within the rules of the game, or the post-constitutional stage. This sort of way of looking at politics highlights the rules, the importance of rules, and the idea that different rules lead to different outcomes. So if we're dissatisfied with political outcomes, perhaps distributional effects, that we should look to the rules rather than tinkering with the standard variables that you might hear in standard political rhetoric. The framework that we employ will complement Buchanan and Tullock. It's called political catallaxy. So this is naturally following from the applying the tools of economics or price theory, praxeology, to political formula or political phenomena, as did James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock in their 1962 work, A Calculus of Consent. And just as these tools are used in commercial contexts to explain an unplanned order of markets as a result of individuals economizing behavior and the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, as Adam Smith would say, we use these tools in the service of what might be called the emergent theory of the modern state, one that focuses on deriving outcomes from particular political bargains made by the holders of what we call political property rights. This way of thinking collapses that two-stage game of political economy, the constitutional stage and the post-constitutional stage, onto itself, where both stages take place simultaneously through a series of political bargains. So constitutional exchange, post-constitutional exchange taking place at the same time. This framework merges the static with the dynamic. It advances Buchanan's project of constitutional political economy in a more Austrian or dynamic direction. Richard Wagner refers to this as entangled political economy. This is essentially political outcomes as a spontaneous order, hence emergent politics in our title. Standard analysis in political economy depicts political activity as completely independent of economic activity, whereas entangled political economy sees the two as interacting. So business and voluntary activity interacting consistently and constantly with the coercive activities of the state, both sort of engaging in a political exchange to help one another, or sometimes and often to hinder one another at achieving their ends. The process is evolutionary, and the de facto rules are constantly being chosen, altered, and bargained over in this process. The standard approach to political economy presumes that the state is an organization. That is, it presumes that the internal coherence of the state, such that it has a sort of teleology, it has a purpose. It presumes that that this purpose could be characterized by a single objective function. Instead, the emergent approach of Wagner characterizes the state as an order or an uncoordinated and unplanned, controlled network of organizations that each operate semi-autonomously and are also entangled with the activities of various commercial enterprises. So the key question for a theory of a political catallaxy is, how does this approach of political economy change when we recognize that the state is not an organization, but rather an order? And in other words, does this idea of getting the Constitution right take on ambiguous meaning? So I want to emphasize here that our approach is positive and not normative. We're not trying to insist on the desirability of a liberal constitution, although the undertones will probably suggest that we do desire a liberal constitution. but rather we are trying to explain and understand how fragile liberal constitutions are and how they tend to drift in the direction of a hierarchical or bureaucratic state. Political property rights are important to this analysis, and so it's just right that we give them a definition. So to us, political property rights are a right which guarantees an individual or a group of individuals to participate in political decision-making and a right to a claim on the benefits or the revenue derived or generated in that process. De jure political structures lead to de facto political property rights, which lead to constitutional erosion. And specifically, like I said, what we are trying to explain in our analysis here is not just erosion, but erosion in a certain direction, that is erosion in the direction of hierarchy or a more centralized bureaucratic state. So following from the footsteps of Buchanan and Tulloch, we use the United States as an example, but this theory is generalizable in the sense that it applies to any formal attempt to establish liberalism via constitutional reform or constitutional organization. The question is, how robust are political or liberal political constitutions, especially ones that try to enshrine their constitutions with procedural liberalism, these tinkering with checks and balances or instituting clever mechanisms for limiting political power, or in this Madisonian or Alexander Hamilton Federalist type way. So how does a constitution of liberty become a constitution of control? Well, in the span of 3 generations, beginning in the late 19th century, the US constitutional arrangements changed from a federalist system of divided government into a nationalist system of administrative bureaucratic control concentrated in the executive branch, I guess more heavily concentrated in the executive branch than in the other 2. This transformation was enshrined by the New Deal, post-Depression and pre-World War II, and it remains the de facto constitutional order of the United States today, which is unfortunate. And if limited government means what it supposedly means, in particular constitutional limited government refers to government institutions operating according to the procedures of its referent social contract, and there is no longer limited government in the United States. Rather, there is the Enlightenment ideal of governance according to general, predictable, and broadly agreed upon rules are gone. We now have governance according to particular and opaque administrative law under the auspices of executive order, executive discretion. So here we have this distinction between de jure and de facto, which I've sort of been using these terms candidly throughout the talk, but de jure are, of course, the formal written rules, the legal norms that are written and set in stone in this constitutional process. They establish the rules from a large set of potentially feasible rules. So we sit down, and you can imagine people sitting down and discussing at a constitutional stage the set of feasible rules that could go into constructing a political order. And they act, once they are established, as coordinating devices for the holders of political power. And then de facto rules are the informal norms, like how people actually obey rules in action. They establish who possess the political property rights in action, and they allow for political bargains or gains from trade. So a de jure constitution could potentially reflect the actual balance of power within a political society, but it doesn't necessarily have to do so. For instance, Voigt argues that de facto constitutional change can implicitly take place in a number of ways. Mainly, opposing political interests can make further bargains within the debate over competing interpretations of the formal constitutional rules. So because constitutions do not stipulate precisely what each and every actor in each and every situation must do, a great deal of discretion is permitted. Political actors must rely on their interpretations of what is allowed by the formal constitution when they act, and then agreed upon institutions of proper conduct represent the de facto or the informal norms which people act upon in practice when they're actually engaging in the political process. All of these examples of exchange and political bargain, they're ubiquitous throughout society. We see them all the time. Political exchange and political bargaining happen all around us, and they often result in this constitutional drift that we're trying to describe. In the US, we have, as an example, the Articles of Confederation transforming into the Constitution that we know today. This was the result not of some big revolution. Of course, the revolution happened almost a decade earlier, but the process by which this transformation took place was one of political exchange, not of revolution or usurpation or revolt. Same from this transformation from limited to universal suffrage, extending suffrage to women, extended suffrage to non-property right holders, extending suffrage and the right to vote to minorities. This was a process of bargaining, not of political revolts. Although revolt is part of the story, the main story is one of consent and exchange among participating groups with interests in the outcomes of this process. The same could be said in Europe. From monarchies to competing democratic authorities in Europe, we have a process that took place over many generations that was one of political bargains and political exchange of property rights, political property rights specifically. So there seems to be a potential incompatibility between formal constitutions and liberalism. Political bargains, including constitutional bargains, will change the decision procedure for the state until its de facto constitution no longer resembles its de jure constitution. What we require now is a better understanding of these mechanisms by which the constitutional bargains proceed. And classical elite theorists, in particular Robert Michels, Gaetano Mosca, and Vilfredo Pareto, are fertile sources for understanding the relationship between the constitutional bargains and the constitutional bargainers and the interests that are at play when they are engaging in the exchange process. So Michels contends that oligarchy is the necessary outcome of even extremely or highly democratic organizations. Changing the ruling class or replacing one group of rulers with another does not necessarily act as a cure-all or a panacea. So he says here, quote, "Always and necessarily there springs from the masses a new organized minority which raises itself to the rank of a governing class. This ruling class will scarcely represent the will of the majority, as the form in which the elites take is that of a concentrated minority with the means to dominate others. So this is true as the ruling party must necessarily diverge from the original ends sought by the group. Thus, even highly democratic environments with widespread franchise and frequent elections, political parties themselves will come to be run by a group of concentrated insiders who administer the party, they steward the resources, they sort of formulate the agenda, and especially what gets put on the table, what gets put up for vote. They implement the goals. And this is opposed to party officials trailing the will of the people. The iron law of oligarchy suggests that the will of the people trails the oligarchs. Next we have Mosca, who wrote a book called The Ruling Class in 1939. He focuses particularly on what he calls the political formula, which is a moral basis or principle on which the power of the political class rests. Mosca notes that all societies have a political formula. The selection of elites is determined in part by this formula. So you could imagine like the selection of Trump being determined by some sort of formula that he must have appealed to in order to reach the position that he ended up reaching, or having so much success in politics. The actions of elites and in positions of political authority serve to change the public interpretation of the political formula, and the selection criteria for new leaders alters this political formula, and so on and so forth. In short, the ruling majority makes use of the political formula as a means to justify their rule. While the ruling class is always a minority group, the group's rule is dependent upon the legitimacy it maintains with the majority. The important idea here is that informal norms and the beliefs beliefs are really what constrain what is politically possible in the long run and the short run. And elites use this truth, they use this knowledge to their own benefit to guide their behavior. In Mind and Society, Vilfredo Pareto makes an important distinction between logical and non-logical action. Logical action essentially being means-ends compatible, or means-ends consistent, and non-logical being the opposite, means-ends inconsistent. Governments are likely, especially bureaucracies and government parties, will typically be characterized by non-logical action, means-ends inconsistent, because there's no institutional mechanisms that will filter out means-ends inconsistencies. And to the extent that people can gather in concentrated groups, they can concentrate the benefits of non-logical action upon themselves and disperse the costs among those who exist outside of the elite class. His idea of elites, well, see, for Pareto, the elites characterize society. So the characteristics of a society strongly resemble the characteristics of its elites. meaning that those who are upstream in matters of wealth and culture and politics, they govern what those who are downstream believe. They sort of formulate what Moscow might have just called the political formula. We can say that the remainder of the population follows the impulses given by the elites. And ideally, those who rise in the circle of elites will do so on their merits, but in actual societies, this is almost never the case. The entrance into the circle of elites is necessarily partly restricted due to the social networks that arise organically between existing elites. And this allows for this establishment of rent-seeking societies. So those within the elite class, once again, can concentrate benefits among themselves and disperse the costs to those who are prevented from even entering the elite class because they don't have those social networks to sort of penetrate the elite class. Okay, so what's missing from this classical elite theory is institutions. Specifically, Richard Wagner provides some institutional context. Because political organizations are a peculiar type of enterprise, they must deliver returns to their supporters. Yeah, they must deliver returns to their supporters and agents, but the process of generating and providing these returns must be informal. So once again, this is apparent from the development of the historical transformations within the United States. So it was the informal constraints, those that have been internalized by the political actors, that really constrained the maximizing behavior that led them to exploit gains from political exchange in the long run. And this is a really big difference between like the market and bureaucracy. We have budget maximization versus quasi-market exchange. These institutional backgrounds or the institutional rules that exist in the market versus like bureaucracy or governments are what direct the process, but it's the informal norms which really guide the behavior of the participants within that institutional context. Okay, so to summarize here, we have this idea that political economy is founded on rational action. Thus, it's subject to the laws of economics, price theory, praxeology, and we can assume rational behavior. Politics is a peculiar type of business, and something in this business is being exchanged, even though there's obviously a great deal of coercion as well. Political exchange depends on these political property rights because that is essentially what's being exchanged. The right to govern and participate in governing decision-making and the right to reap the benefits from that decision-making process. Formal constitutions attempt to solidify an existing arrangement of political property rights on day one. So day one, we form a constitution and we are attempting to sort of set in stone the existing political property rights arrangements, as well as the rules for changing or altering these arrangements in the future. But gains from exchange and the uncertainty and ambiguity of what those rules actually mean, so they rely on everyone's subjective interpretation of the rules, will lead rational actors to alter the de jure arrangement, the formal arrangement, based on the de facto or the informal political property rights, but not only that, the informal norms that people observe in their own individual actions. The scope of these exchanges are limited by a complex set of ideologies and informal norms, and thus formal constitutions are neither necessary nor sufficient instruments for establishing a long-lasting governance of a system constituted in liberty. And that's really the ultimate conclusion here. This is a really abstract, broad beginning of a much larger project that Richard Wagner is sort of embarking on. De facto constitutions matter more than de jure. The de facto constitutions are what really make for the de jure or the formal rules that we see that become established and create these liberal societies that we see all around us. And likewise, these de facto constitutions, these de facto norms, are what will prevent, or perhaps our only hope at preventing this constitutional drift, this fragility of liberalism, constitutional drift in the direction of bureaucratic states. Constitutions and informal norms especially are what matter when attempting to maintain a government constituted in liberalism over the long run.